and submit requests for seeds. And I will end the share right there. And I will announce our speaker for tonight. And for those of you who haven't been to our meetings before, I did get one question about that. We normally start our meetings with a plant share, and then as when the plant share is over is when we start the program for the evening. If you signed up through Eventbrite, you might not have seen that. It's in our other literature that we send out. So I apologize for anybody. But we are going to be starting our speaker right now. Our speaker tonight is Lech Naumovich, and he's going to be talking about restoration of Mount Umunhum and restoration of the summit of Mount Umunhum. Lech has an extensive experience in restoration ecology and native plant conservation science. He's very active in several aspects of the California Native Plant Society, including conservation and identifying plants, especially in the East Bay. And he teaches courses in restoration ecology and manages restoration projects throughout the Bay Area. And I will turn it over now to Lech.
Thank you for that introduction, Janet. I'm really happy to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? Raise your hand if you can. I can see you all. All right, good. Well, what I'm going to do here is hopefully share my screen, and hopefully if you have any sort of issue, press the share button, there we go. Please throw something up on the chat and hopefully somebody will notify me, Janet, if you don't mind.
I will do that.
If we're having any technical issues. So honored to be here. Thank you all so much. I love the fact that you all are sharing these pictures of plants and hearing the scientific names rolling off of your tongues with ease makes me feel like I'm in the right place. So I appreciate that. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the restoration of Mount Umunhum. I'm going to try and compact 5+ years of work into 45 minutes. So inevitably there'll be things I skip and such. Please take notes, write comments, and we'll have a question and answer session in the end. I am Executive Director of Golden Hour Restoration Institute. We're a nonprofit that works predominantly in the Bay Area. And our whole goal is to create more value in projects by providing technical expertise and providing touch points where volunteers and the community can get involved to provide a long-lasting stewardship outcome. So without further ado, let's see if I can move forward. So the first thing I wanted to start you off with and see if I can manage to do this correctly, and hopefully everybody will get the audio here. This is a really beautiful 11-minute film. I'm not going to show you 11 minutes. You're going to get about 3 minutes, probably about 2.5. And it's going to set the stage. There's a link to the video, so don't despair. You'll get to watch it, and it'll be at the PDF at the end. And hopefully everybody will hear it here as I share the sound.
Land and say, yeah, our ancestors were there. I think it's like they're telling you, you're going to be coming back more and more. And every time you come to a ceremony or to a place like this, they're there waiting for us. And so being here is just, that's the feeling. That's the feeling of just the ancestors saying, you belong here. Welcome.
You know, our language and our culture has always been with us, in our heart, in our blood, in our, you know, within us. And so, you know, we're awakening it now. The mountain's waking up, and our access to it is coming about, and we're able to restore that relationship with Mount Umunhum. This mountain, though, is a sacred mountain, and it's a, the most important thing here is the spirituality of this mountain. And it's a place to come and pray, a place to heal, a place to ask for help. That's where we are today.
So this is a special place for a whole lot of folks and indigenous people. So for folks that aren't familiar, that's the Amamutsen tribe, Amahmutsen. They've been part of this landscape for a very long time. And, they are the original people, the First Nations, the Indians. You can call them as you please, as long as you recognize that it was their land first. So I wanted to put that piece in there. I urge you to listen to the whole movie. It's a beautiful piece. It's only about 11 minutes long. And like I said, I'll share the link. Provide you a little bit about what I hope to do today. Talk about the history, the impacts, some of the constraints of this really remarkable site, Mount Umunhum. We're going to talk about the resources of significance, what we keyed into and what we wanted to save, what we wanted to amplify. We're going to talk about the cultural mandate that we felt once we took on this project linked to the Amamutsen. We're going to talk about site planning and the work we did with Restoration Design Group and a number of other consultants, the build out, how we did the build out, and then just a few tastes of the results that we had there. So here's Mount Umunhum. Probably the most famous part of Mount Umunhum is actually the cube, as it's mentioned or referenced often. It's a 120-foot tower on top of a peak. And Mount Umunhum sits in the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's viewed from a lot of the South Bay. What's remarkable about it is it's officially called the fourth highest peak in the Santa Cruz Mountains, behind Loma Prieta and the two other peaks that connect the Loma Prieta Ridge. In fact, if you count Loma Prieta as a ridge, this is the second highest peak in the Santa Cruz Mountains, towering over 3,400 feet. So it is a fairly unique peak with a whole lot of history that I talked about, starting with the Amamutsen. A lot of the early photographs now, we have the military here. So this is the cube that I mentioned. This is the complex of buildings and such. Some of the grading that was done to cut off the mountaintop. And then actually this is where the community lived. So I'll start with the mainstay of it, which is the cube. So this is a radar tower. So this was brought about in the Cold War. Actually, right as the Cold War started to heat up, pardon the pun, there was a lot of interest in creating sites along the western seaboard that were used for early detection. So this is a large radar system for early detection so that they could ostensibly discover Russian bombers coming in and then launch a counterattack. There were about 23 of these sites across the western seaboard. And this one was initiated sometime around 1957. And you can see it became a community. At any given point, there were about 120, 150 folks living up here with their families. And what was pretty remarkable is in this compound, there was a natatorium with an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, obviously a large dining hall, and then the actual individual homes and such. And you know, it was actually kind of interesting, if I remember this correctly. I believe the captain's housing was farthest down, so that if the site was actually attacked, they would be furthest away from any sort of impact. And then the lower ranking you were, the higher you were up on the mountain and closer to danger and closer to needing to run up the road to take care of business when emergencies happened. As we know, in today's world, claim to fame, you know you've made it when you're on the cover of a phone book. So this is the Campbell San Martin Saratoga phone book, and there's Mount Umunhum with its famous radar tower. I believe this is sometime, this is circa 1963 or so, plus or minus a couple of years. And this is basically what it's, you know, another aerial view where, again, you can see the large tower. The housing was away from it, so this is one ridge. And as I talk about our site, this is where the majority of our work is being conducted. So from the cube on down to, you'll see this flat area here and all the diagrams. To give you scale here, that distance is roughly about 1/8 of a mile. This facility, a lot of it is demolished now. There's very little that remains. But if you're lucky enough to get up there at the right time, you will actually see some of the swimming pool tiles still there and a little 6-foot marker for where I'm guessing you could dive in. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the resources. You all are familiar with this map, of course. Here we are in the South Bay. This red line goes around what a lot of ecologists consider the Santa Cruz Mountains. The way the symbology works is yellow is lower elevation and green gets to the higher elevations. Here is the higher elevation spine that includes Loma Prieta and Mount Umunhum. Remarkably, very, very close to town as the crow flies. So getting to, for instance, the intersection of Camden and, oh gosh, what would it be? Somewhere around Camden and 85 is a mere, I would only say 10 miles as a crow flies. Driving it, it's a solid hour, an hour and 15 minutes. But this little area here you can see is a major coastal ridge. If you think about the way our weather patterns work and you see the way this elevation works, you can imagine there's a whole lot of fog that's coming in from the west and sitting in this higher ridge here. So some of the wettest weather in the Bay Area has been recorded in the Mount Umunhum, Loma Prieta area. There have been, there is data that indicates that over 100 inches have fallen in 1 year in this area. So remarkably wet. And then in the summer, remember, we're at 3,400 feet. It's wind blown, it gets dry. Think about the way our wind patterns shift, and suddenly it gets really hot and dry. So you go from really wet, almost tropical amounts of rainfall all the way to extremely xeric environments that are really, really difficult. So that's some of the resources we're thinking about there, and how to, one of the constraints of what can we do with those kind of swings on this summit. So here is a photo actually coming up the road. I'm almost at the Bald Mountain staging area coming up. This is Mount Umunhum in the distance here, and of course you can see that telltale cube there. The vegetation diversity here is remarkable. I won't get too far into vegetation classes, but coastal live oak woodlands, interior oak woodlands, chaparral dominated by manzanitas, arctostaphylos, as well as ceanothus, chamise, all the way into grasslands. And this is what's actually fairly unique is what I like about this photo. As you view this photo, you will see a lot of greenery and scrub. And then right as you get to the summit, there's this remarkable beige area here. Most people would attribute to herbaceous vegetation dominated by grasses and such. And there aren't that many areas nearby with that. So this is kind of a unique little signature that we had here on the mountain. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. Another one of the really unique resources here are the purple martins. I don't know how many folks are familiar with these birds, but they are remarkable. They do an annual migration from North America to South America, and they tend to, they started popping up on the summit of Mount Umunhum. As military activity has decreased, we've noticed nature moving in on its own, and that's been phenomenal. And so actually there have been a number of folks at Mid-Peninsula Open Space District who now own this property and own this as a park, have been putting up these type of feeders. They're not exactly this type, but there's a number of them there, and you can actually get in there and see the purple martins. And they're just remarkable birds. They live in communities, and their main feeding prey is insects, small bugs, butterflies, and such. And so having that kind of herbaceous plant structure that I showed on that face of Mount Umunhum is probably one reason they're coming here, because they know there's going to be a healthy supply of food for them. The other significant resource is from a botanical conservation realm, is that whenever you get into these high, rocky, exposed areas, that's where you find vegetation diversity, but also plant diversity. So a number of the rare plants here that are really unique. This is Eriogonum saxatale. So this is a rock sanicle. I believe the nearest location of this is Mount Diablo. I'm trying to remember if it's on Hamilton. I don't believe it is. But you can imagine here, Mount Diablo, pretty distinct geological differences as well as the distance between them. This is called the most beautiful jewel flower. There's some taxonomy questions about it, although the taxonomy study has been done. This is a rare plant, and it's actually a mustard family, which most people don't recognize right off the bat. It's a highly evolved mustard family with those petals starting to fuse, and then actually really having a nice bilateral symmetry about them. And you can see some of the siliques here starting to form, and they look a lot more like mustard pods. And then this is a really interesting little guy. This is a flat-leaved onion, Allium falcifolium. Onions are bulbs. You all were talking about irises. A lot of people don't love growing alliums. They can be really picky. They're good to eat if you like garlic, but this one in particular has these really notably flat leaves. And again, some of the nearest locations of this are Mount Diablo, Mount Tam, other high peaks. So you really, when you look at the vegetation diversity and you really pick out individual plants here on Umunhum, it is fairly remarkable how many of these plants occur just at these mountain summits and plus or minus 200 feet elevation from them. So this kind of theory of the sky islands and how these species have come to evolve and colonize those areas. So those are all resources we wanted to maintain. There's also just a beautiful mix of wildflowers. So you might be able to see it here a little bit. This is chamise. So this is what we would call chamise scrub or chaparral, a hard chaparral. And in here, you know, you have beautiful things like Platystemen and things in the Ranunculaceae family. So there's a lot of life in these multiple layers. A lot of this site, remarkably, once it was taken over by the military, the surrounding area, there was very little going on. There was a whole lot of security around there. So there was actually very little kind of mining activity, logging, hunting, any sort of those, even recreational uses. And so it's a very wild area in a whole lot of ways. In addition, it's very hard to travel there. And so I'll talk a little bit about this. This is our ruck buckwheat. We use 6-letter codes. I'm sure sometimes you all do that too. Eriogonum saxatile. These are little guys we grew. So obviously there's no seed commercially available for this plant, or very little. We wanted to maintain the local genetics. So one of our goals was actually doing very, very local seed collection and actually seeing if we could propagate these plants to maintain that genetic diversity. And then finally, as I've mentioned, the Umunhum, which were a cornerstone and a pillar of this work. And as you listen to more of that movie, I think there's a really beautiful, candid conversation with Steve Abers, who was the general manager of MidPenn, where he was talking to Val Lopez. Val Lopez was the elder with the medicine pouch around his neck. In that film, he was talking quite a bit. There were quite a few conversations about Steve Abers and him realizing this is where their origin story was. So as you look at their hummingbird, the hummingbird, Mount Umunhum is the birthplace of the hummingbird. And so it's a really important area for this tribe. And it's a sacred site. It's not necessarily a site they'd live, but it's a site where they come to, like they said, pray, have ceremonies and such. And so that was a real big integration that we wanted to have in there. And that was almost, as I spoke about that cultural mandate, in today's day and age, if we're not going to do anything as conservation groups, land management groups, to start appropriating land back to the native cultures, no one else will. And so this was, I thought, a really powerful move by Steve and everyone else at MidPenn to say, yeah, this is number one. Let's make sure this is a sacred space. Moving forward a couple of years, they actually did something remarkable and created a cultural easement. You all are probably familiar with conservation easements that take away certain development rights. This is a cultural easement that actually provided any sort, that provided the Amamutsan the ability to conduct their whatever they felt appropriate in terms of cultural ceremonies and such on the summit. So there are times they actually just close off the summit and they'll have a sacred ceremony up there and no one else is allowed. And sometimes they have ceremonies that are more open depending on what they're looking at. So, and what they're either celebrating or commemorating. So that was a big part of this design. And so here's the site planning. Hopefully this will kind of make sense. There's an aerial behind this and then you'll see a whole lot of lines. Here's this road coming up. It kind of winds up, and again, I'll use this point of reference. So this is the actual cube that we talked about. After much discussion, there was an intention to leave the cube. In many ways, it's considered a historical structure. In another way, it celebrates the past, it being Veterans Day. Happy Veterans Day to everyone. It celebrates that portion of the history of this landscape too. And, you know, there are a lot of great people who have served, who have given a lot over the years to helping shape America, sometimes in very powerful ways. So this, you know, although it may seem culturally anachronistic and such, there is a real intention to retain that. There's also a little bit of an expense to remove it because of the cost and potential contamination and such. But all arrows were kind of pointing to, let's leave this on the landscape. So this was a central point. The road coming up was a central point. And if you see, we have a circle here. So there's no actual parking right at the summit, except for folks that are mobility limited and need a little extra help. There are a couple spots there. But otherwise, you come around this and then you have to park at this lower parking lot. In the end, this parking lot here, the middle parking lot was not created, but this lower one has quite a few spaces. And then in here, there was a real intention to create, this is the ceremonial circle. So you'll see this is for the Amamutsan. This was a central point of the planning. As much as the cube was staying there, one of the first things that was placed was the ceremonial circle. Where is that going? How does that align with where they would naturally have it? And so there was a lot of moving the site around in order to make sure that we were preserving culturally what seemed appropriate for the Amamutsan. There's a rescue helipad over here for safety, a large turnaround area. In addition, here there is also a nice interpretive overlook that you'll see. But as we were planning the site, there is a real interest in kind of keeping the flow going from the summit, isolating traffic over in an area, and allowing it to be cars to be a less prominent part of being on the summit. We all know that sometimes you get to the summit and it's a big parking lot. The intent here was really to have to at least earn that last 192 steps on the stairwell going up to the summit. And that was done with Restoration Design Group. I mentioned them down here. They're a phenomenal group that has done restoration throughout California, as well as with a number of engineers. So here's a little bit of that south-facing slope that I showed you that was so herbaceous. So one of the things we wanted to do was really do as much documentation around the edges that we thought were going to be representative of what was once on the summit. We really had no botanical surveys of the summit, no real pictures before the Army was there. And so we really couldn't get an idea of what it looked like. And so we had to put a couple pieces together here, including how it was going to be contoured and have two remote summits, a west summit and an east summit. And so a lot of our job here at Golden Hour was actually documenting different vegetation communities, the rocks, in this case, Selaginella, some of the mosses, and really thinking about how do we continue to push that community towards the top, and so that the top can kind of heal and bring back native resources. So one of the site plannings we did, so as you can imagine, you saw the summit beforehand. It had a lot of buildings. It was graded. We pushed a lot of rock around. And actually, I'm going to jump back to that slide in a second. Here we are in the restoration process, pushing around, and you can see the size of these excavators. This is remarkable. The ceremonial circle is under construction here. It was done by expert masons. There is not a single bit of glue, concrete, any sort of thing like that. It is truly a monument. And then you can see here, we're going over these and creating these summits. So this is the west summit area, the ceremonial circle. Here's the road coming back up. The turnaround is just out of view. A lot of contouring. I think we were pushing dirt here for about 6 months, nonstop, with the biggest, most expensive equipment that you can imagine. And part of what we were doing was taking some of the soils from the side and pulling them back up. So we were trying to, instill some of that fertility, the bacterial community, the mycorrhizal community, and push it back up. But it took a lot of, there was a fair amount of time spent just pushing around soil. And so since the soil was so rocky and we knew nutrients would be limiting. In fact, it was, if you imagine planting your garden in a pile of gravel, except imagine the gravel is all sorts of different sizes. There's a whole lot of limitations there to survivorship. So what we did here was each one of these letter groups is a code of plants. And we started drawing up ideas of how to do this. And so we actually took from the island idea, and this is a typical island where we're planting plants on 1 foot centers or even 8-inch centers and really clustering them together. And then taking this whole island, that would be the place where we might fertilize and add more soil. And then there would be a distinct break, 5, 10, 15, 20 feet, and then you get to the next island. So if you can imagine it, you know, our model for doing this and providing fertility, places that are easy to manage, was to really create these islands which were kind of self-contained mini gardens. This is what the soil looks like in an ideal situation up there. So this is the native soil. This was done by Vic Klassen at UC Davis, phenomenal soil scientist. You can see the native vegetation here, some of the bunch grasses. We took this cross section, and what he's showing here is some of the roots, the rooting depth, and you can see the angularity of the soil. So this is typical. And there's a whole lot of room for roots to grow and such. This was our ideal. This is what we wanted to create. In reality, what we found was there were a whole lot of large 6-inch to 12-inch angular rocks with very little soil in between them. So we had to figure out a very specific planting and site planning. So we created this diagram, which, you know, kind of allowed us to envision how are we going to have things survive out here. And the goal was to, first of all, this is our little plant, and this is the container it came in. This could be a 1 gallon or smaller than that. And as you notice, we're excavating to either side and below at least 5 times the volume. And the idea there is then at the bottom, we're backfilling with some native soil, which has the inoculant. We're also adding some, we're excavating it out and then putting back some compost in the bottom. So that's an easy rooting environment. It's material that won't necessarily be bioavailable to weeds that happen to come in. So this was very much targeted. And then the excavated soil we fit back in here. And then to avoid desiccation, we didn't want to necessarily put mulch on this thing. And instead we decided, hey, actually let's try rock mulch instead of wooden mulch. Wooden mulch is going to break down. It's going to get dry. It's going to look ugly. There's no wooden mulch up there anyway. It's a mountaintop. So we actually mulched each individual planting with some of the rocks. And so you will see these images where people are using rocks as mulch on top to retain moisture. You know, and all this is in hopes of getting biological activity back in here. Being a restoration ecologist, we knew the limiting factors here were going to be getting plants established, getting plants to thrive out here. And a big part of that is the pollinators. So this is Clarkia rubicunda that is found up there, one of our native pollinators here on this Clarkia and guests and such. We really wanted to get that insect community going, and we knew we needed to do that with immediate pollen resources, and studies by folks like out of Berkeley, Professor Franke and others indicate that, you know, if you build it, they will come. And pollinators are remarkable. You all know this. You put a new set of flowers, anything blooming out in your garden, you start seeing all sorts of bees and wasps and hummingbirds and butterflies that you've never seen before. They're remarkably good seekers of good resources. And so in restoring this, we were really thinking a lot about how to create floral resources to get these little guys going and hopefully get them to start to call this place home. So here's that site planning, and this is how it finally turned out. So here's our turnaround. Here's the tower again. This is the east summit. This provides views towards the south and I guess into the Morgan Hill area and such. We created, as you can see, just these outlined areas. These are the areas we're planting. So again, you imagine that whole summit project, and I can't tell you how many planners we had extensive conversation with that wanted to plant things on 3 to 6 foot centers on a grid across the site to get things going. And we had to really push back and say, look, this is going to take a lot of work getting life back up on the summit so it doesn't look like a big old gravel pit. And so we really targeted specific areas and really put a whole lot of resources and planting islands into those areas with the hope that as those get established, then we start to expand. So you'll see this is the phase 1 areas in these dotted lines, and then the phase 2 are some of these hatched areas. So that's either year 2 or year 3 once we feel comfortable with what's going on there. And then we had additional phases, rock gardens and such to start to fill it in. But we knew this was going to be a long process, and we really tried to hedge our bets saying, let's work on a couple of these phase 1 areas and really get them to as a proof of concept to know that we can actually restore plants to this area. You saw this slide. So again, ceremonial circle. So to put it into perspective, you know, these are the size areas. If you can see my hand, they're not much larger than that excavator where we actually put a lot of resources in. So that area, for instance, would have 500 plants installed into it. Just a remarkable amount of resources, really trying to kickstart patches of fertility, patches of life on the summit. This is what it looked like in reality. I know all you gardeners are just probably dying to get your spade in there and put your favorite iris bulb in there. It was tough. This is the reality. You can do as much planting as you want, and then after they move the dirt and you get a couple rains and the dust settles and it looks like this, you suddenly realize, how are we really going to do this? So this is where the rock mulching came into play and really excavating those holes far enough so that we could kind of bring life back to these areas. Here's Amanda Mills from Mid-Penn. She a phenomenal project manager for this. A lot of the success of this project is because of her. I'm lucky to have worked with her and continue to work with her on this. But part of what we're doing, as you can see, we're putting flags out in areas. We're trying to push away from areas like this, which is, you know, these 12-inch, 6-inch, 18-inch cobble, and go into areas where there's actually some residual soil. And so oftentimes we were even pushing our planting areas a little bit based on what material was there at the end of all the grading. So this was an example of how close we were planting them. We're using the rocks as resources to kind of plant them, provide some sort of shade. The rocks would be kind of embedded into the soil, so you can imagine as it rains, the water comes down the rock surface and hopefully provides a deep watering. So this is kind of a sample, if you will, group of 5 plants we might have planted right here as the beginning of an island. So here's our work days. There's Amanda starting out, talking with everyone. You can see we have rock bars. We got water sprayers to spray the plants. And then here are some of the phenomenal plants that were grown by Acterra. I think to date, they've grown over 10,000 plants for this project. And these volunteers were just incredible, really hardy people, local folks who came out and were willing to dig in that rocky soil and install these little guys. Intentionally, we kept a lot of these a little bit smaller than 1 gallons because we thought we'd have a better chance of getting them installed and providing the soil around them. So we really wanted to, the larger container planting we started with, the larger that hole needed to be based on our specs. So we really wanted to be thoughtful. Here's our rock sanicle again. Here's a Phacelia that did wonderfully well up there. And here's Cindy Rossler. Unfortunately, she's retired and moved on, but here she is giving a demo. So in the first part, we would always give the demo, how to make the hole, how to clear the rock out, how to backfill, how to add native soil, how to pre-water, post-water and such. It was about a 15-minute demo. And the beauty is these people sat through it and then they came back for year after year after year, continued planting in multiple phases. These are all purely volunteers. Some had really nice socks and gaiters. But it was a really neat group, and you can see this. This is not your typical planting site. So, but I want you to look here. We're next to the cube. The shelter, the interpretive shelter, is just off to the right of this photo. But you'll get to see some photos of this site later. We call it the Tower Garden area. But you can look at it right now. It doesn't look like a garden. Here's another shot of folks installing, again, volunteers. You can see, you would think Home Depot sponsored this project. At some point, we need to approach them for more money. But, you know, this is water, soil inoculant, compost. All these materials we're adding into this soil. And you can see these soils are pretty much monochromatic, very low organic matter. You can tell there's a different particle size. This actually has a little bit more soil. It has a little bit more carbon nitrogen to it. It's a better granular form for us to put these plants in. And so those were the areas we were trying to focus the volunteer effort on. If you were lucky enough to volunteer early on, you got to actually camp out on the mountain. We somehow convinced the people above that we should have a camping trip, moonlight on the mountain, for a 2-day volunteer extravaganza. We had it catered and a huge barbecue hosted by friends. Well, they were folks that I've worked with in the past. And we produced, we did a slideshow here. A couple of folks did a slideshow on Mount Umunhum, including some extremely knowledgeable botanists who have explored it quite a bit, some of the planners. And so this is actually showing up on the side of the cube. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but these are the city lights below. And then here's somebody with their headlamp on, looking at something. So this was pretty special that we got a chance to do a slideshow, a camp out. There is no camping up there. You will get arrested. You'll get sent to jail, maybe sent on a boat somewhere. So don't try it. I'm probably not allowed to show this photo actually, but it happened. So I'll move on. So here's the outcome of our restoration installs. So you can see the rock mulching here, 1, 2, 3 plants, okay? And as we progressed in this, we might have put a 4th plant here and then a 5th one over here. You'll notice the rock mulching, the close proximity. One of the beauties to this kind of arrangement is that as we brought in that 5-gallon bucket, guess what? We're not watering one plant on 3 feet center where that water goes nowhere. We're watering 5 plants at the same time. So we know a much higher percentage of the water that we are delivering and bringing up here is actually getting to the plants. So we thought that was a pretty big win with this kind of design spec and knowing how dry and hot it gets here in the summer. In fact, it gets so dry and hot, there are tarantulas out there. There weren't a whole lot of occurrences of known tarantulas, but there we were out there planting, and alas, a furry friend came out and joined us for a little bit. So that was a pretty neat surprise. And again, part of that community we're hoping to restore. We had all sorts of interesting issues with installation. Here we are. You can see these are not kids just making that soupy thing you make during recess when your teachers aren't watching. Instead, it was remarkable how, even though you can see next to this gentleman, there are these large rocks. The soils were so compacted in some areas by the equipment, much to our chagrin and much according to the engineering spec, that the water wouldn't actually drain. So even though they've gone through the hard work of digging the hole, then they get these huge holes, they fill them with water because we were pre-watering to get a deep water going. They'd have to sit there and watch the mud subside and the water to drain, and sometimes that would take a little while. And so what they would then do is dig another couple holes, then they'd come back to these and plant in these. But here again, you can see that planting. You can see we're pretty much making a rock garden in here. Of course, the overnight that we did, it was extremely hot. And so luckily we brought some canopies with us, knowing that the temperatures were up into the 90s up there with no shade. And so we would move around these structures and plant. Here you can see a gentleman watering a group of plants, but it was a large, we would have 15 to 18 people at any given point kind of working and installing these islands. And guess where this is? This is the tower garden area. So this is that big rocky mess that I showed you. Cindy was doing a demonstration with the cube off to the side. In this photo, the cube is over here, so it's turned around. But Areophyllums, these are Dudleas in here, penstemons, all sorts of pretty good success. And this is a year and a half after planting. So we wanted to create these pollinator resources. We created some. We definitely feel comfortable. We created some. There's a lot of bare ground in between for the ground nesting bees and pollinators and such. Here we are. Here's that interpretive center. So this is the tower garden area. We're on the other side of the circle now. Here's one of our restoration areas. What I love about this picture is I actually feel like we got something right. And what I mean by that, not necessarily the size of the plants, but the patchiness of them. As you look at that previous photo, remember that patchiness of the vegetation. This isn't going to be continuous horizontal vegetation. We're not putting ground covers in here. We're trying to emulate what the vegetation looks like just downslope and bring it up. And so this has that kind of patchy feel. Artemisia californica was a really nice, quick growing plant in here. We have some monardellas, which are coyote mints in here. And it really starts to take on that form. And here's some of that rock buckwheat in flower. Here's that tower garden area, a set of photos, February 2018 when we started. June 2018, you can see some of those plants took off. Adding that compost below was very significant. We were very happy to see the following year, you see these green patches here. We didn't seed it. This was natural recruitment coming from the seeds of some of these plants and forming veritable mats of new seedlings. A lot of those seedlings didn't make it through the summer, but this site started self-recruiting itself and creating new plants from the ones we installed within a year and a half. So this is what we consider a very successful site. I threw this in here so you know, and this is again the cube off to this area here. And this was one of the part of the decommissioned radar tower. You can see the slope and such. This is an old bay tree that's beautiful there. And this is how it was recontoured. So that movement of land and to create those natural slopes, a lot of work by really talented excavators and machine operators. One of the things we really loved about this is we got a chance to go out and do seed collection. So this is a special serpentine meadow, which is similar to what's up on the summit. It's a very rocky site. And here's our field trip crew down here. Ken Hickman, always an amazing botanist. I don't know if he's on this or not, but he's been so formative in helping us put together a plant palette and know what resources are there. And these are areas we'd be collecting in. So these little pink guys, those are the alliums that we were talking about. This allium is a little bit different than the flat-leaved one that I showed you, but similar. A lot of the yellows in here are going to be Lasthenia, otherwise known as goldfields, that John Muir often mentioned. Here we are in Moore's seed collection, and actually I think what we're doing here, sorry, we're not collecting, I think we're actually dispersing some of the seed we got. So after doing so much work on container planting and realizing how long it took, we saw, hey, actually if the seeds fall on the soil and it's somewhat fertile, they're gonna take on a life of their own. And so we started putting more and more effort into seed collection, what we call direct seeding. And we got some pretty good results considering the amount of energy, time, resources it took to direct seed. We've started to shift the program almost fully in this direction, where we are now, instead of putting in a whole lot of container plants, we're putting in seeds tactfully at the right time, collected from locally appropriate areas. So we're, if you will, really bombing the area with native seed resources. Here's our typical group up there. So like I said, we tried to get a group of about 20 people. Mid-Penn staff were absolutely incredible and so integral. Ellen was phenomenal, is phenomenal. Cindy, who has moved on since. There's Amanda. And these volunteers, you know, they continue to come back. We have some volunteers who've been coming back for 5 years. Just getting close to wrapping up here. Some of the, you know, another form of success in my world and in doing these type of projects where we're trying to engage people is looking at what's happening on iNaturalist. Hopefully some of you are familiar with this. This is a program where you can just simply go out with your smartphone, snap some photos. It puts the geocode, a location code on those photos. If you know what it is, you can mark in the ID, and it adds to a collection of data. And then you can actually go in and look at these sites. So this is the Sierra Azul Mount Umunhum site. Now it has over 5,000 observations. And obviously part of the site was open before Mount Umunhum, but you know, over almost 900 species have been documented there, and there's only been access to the site for about 2 years. So it's pretty phenomenal how people are getting out there and what they're seeing and how much biodiversity there is out there. So I intentionally hopefully left some time for questions. I want to give you these resources that are phenomenal. The first one is the information from Mid-Penn. This is the main page. You'll find a lot of information there. There's a fantastic PDF plant guide if you're the kind of person who likes to go out there, print out a page of photos, or even go out there with your iPad and download it. It's organized by color and such, so you can really get to know some of the flora up there. Here's the Umunhum movie I mentioned. It's on Vimeo. It's free to watch. Please share it. And then here's our own restoration plan. It's a kind of a hidden link. If you really want to geek out on the site, it's about 50 pages of documentation about how we did, what we did, when we did, through the initial installation. So at this point, I'll stop talking and say thanks for listening. Did I put everyone to sleep?
Still
That
awake.
was so excellent.
Not sure where Janet went.
Janet?
See, I might have put Janet to sleep.
Oh, there she is. Let me unmute Janet.
I unmuted myself and then somebody muted me again, sorry.
Okay.
And I didn't realize I was not talking into space again. So if anybody has questions, please type them into chat and I will go through them.
I got 55 people.
And I'm working my way down that. Somebody asked what the future looks like for the mountain.
Sure. So this is really exciting. You know, this was a site that Mid-Penn invested a whole lot of money into. This was, in the end, I think about a $14 million project, just the restoration. A large portion of that was the road. There is a road that needed to be redone, some soil stabilization and such. And in providing access, you need to provide, you know, bathrooms and some of those type of things. So there were a number of improvements that have been made there, but it's kind of been the centerpiece of Mid-Penn's work recently. The views are absolutely incredible. There are a lot of bikers there. Given how much press it's gotten, the Amamutsans still have time to enjoy. As far as I know, there haven't been any conflicts with that and any issues with closing the mountain. There's typically nice signage that'll say the mountain's closed today or the mountain will be closed next Tuesday for a ceremony from this hour to this hour. We apologize for any inconvenience. And so, you know, there's the parking, there's some great hiking trails. You can actually hike all the way down from either the Bald Mountain Trailhead, or you can go all the way down to where Mount Umunhum hits Hicks Road. And you can take that full hike up, and it is a fantastic hike, and I highly recommend it. So the future is looking really good. There's continued resources. One of the things we were trying to do with our program was to continue the momentum in vegetation. A lot of engineers and such see, here's how the project starts, here's where it ends, and when it ends, we're out of here because we're starting to work on another project. From the restoration and stewardship end, we see here's how it starts, and we don't think it'll ever end. How do we get people involved so that they can make sure to keep this story evolving, and so that we keep learning from the mountain and enjoying it and being a part of it. So hopefully that provides some context. I think if you haven't been out there, please go out there. But I think the future is really bright, and they're actually, Mid-Penn is working on a couple of adjacent properties too. So it could be part of an even larger preserve. Think local backpacking potentially.
Okay. Another question I have here is, what is your schedule for replanting, watering, and maintaining?
Great question. So replanting, we try to take on once a year. We used to do it in the summer, and since then we've kind of pushed planting to Halloween. We had a nice little costume day where people dressed up and planted, so that was pretty fun. But at that point, we find we usually are outside of any really hot times. Their staff is working on weeding, and that's a big part of it, just kind of keeping these opportunistic weeds that were in the soil out. And then we have invested in watering, or Mid-Penn has, so they actually do have water trucks that come up there and help provide water to get those plants established. It was such a there was so little actually spent on the installation that that seemed like, I think, a reasonable cost to make sure the plants kept going. But what we're doing is we're kind of doing a full watering, tapering down to half watering, quarter watering, and off. So we obviously there's no irrigation set up. We didn't want to deal with that. And all the water has to be brought up by a truck and hand watered. So it's a little bit of work in that sense. But again, I think it's a short-term kind of watering. We're really working hard on tapering that off.
Wow, that's a lot. Bring it up by truck. They do it once a week, or?
I think it's, we try and tune into the schedule with whether it's raining or not and what amount of rain has fallen. Our pattern was to get them make sure there's water there from December through June. And then allow plants to go dormant as they probably would on a summit like that. On average, I think it would end up being once every 2 to 3 weeks. But if there was rain in there, then that would push that date back, right?
Right.
So it was water as needed.
Let's see. Gotten several compliments for that. Several
Thank you.
people found it very inspiring and fascinating. And somebody asked how much more work will be done on the mountain, or is the project mostly finished?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been talking with the Amundsen, actually. I was hoping we'd be farther along on this, but it is where it is. And we were talking about creating a learning garden, actually, right about where the swimming pool was in the natatorium. A little off the summit, but an area has a little bit different soils, a little bit different vegetation, a little bit different exposure towards the west. So that's a project that hopefully will come online where we can do a native learning garden with plants that they traditionally used and harvested. Very much a site kind of an educational resource more than anything. In terms of planting, we this year, unfortunately, our workshops got canceled over concerns of people's health. So we're still working on seed rain, so collecting seed, throwing seed down, and doing that degree, tapering off the water. But we're getting pretty good results and pretty good establishment, and we're getting that patchy kind of matrix that we're hoping for. So I would say there's going to be continued efforts in stewardship for a long time, and likely they'll be fairly volunteer driven.
Is the Native community involved in that? Native American community?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have worked with them, and we have talked about workshops and such, and they just, the planning and the timing never worked out for the workshops. And, I don't think it was a failure on anyone's part. It's a huge project, and we really needed specific dates, and we need to get them launched, get all the materials ready, the rock bars, the trucks, the staff. And it just never coordinated well with the schedules. We're hoping, that won't be a long-term thing, but I think there's some real sensitivity about making it not appropriating culture here. So not inviting the Amundsen just to have the Amundsen there and say they were there, but having them come on their own time. And that's one reason why we don't have the native learning garden yet, because we want that resource. As Val Lopez said, he says, when the elders say it's time, that's when we'll come. And so, we have these schedules, we have success criteria, we have very well programmed, sometimes dogmatic ways of going about things. And what I love about this is that cultural interface where you have to be okay and say, the Amundsen aren't quite ready for this type of exposure, and doing it this way. And that's great. At some point, when the time's ready, we'll be there.
So you envision them planting or being very involved in the learning garden?
Yes, yeah, that's one part. The other part is the travel and such, getting them out to the site. They're a community that's been like a lot of native communities around urban areas. They're very fractured. They're two people that know how to speak their language. So they've been spending a tremendous amount of time just trying to document it so they can retain it. And so it's really interesting. They're at this point where there's so much going on, and there's so much excitement about this. At the same time, they're very aware of their capacity, what they can do, you know, as a tribe, as a people, and what they should prioritize. So I think they realize the mountain's going to be there for them, and it will happen when the time's right. But you know, it's a tribe coming back together, and they're phenomenal people. So
Well, it's really good that you were involved in this project for them, and I'm sure that it will be a resource as they grow. So that's wonderful.
thank you,
And
and
you've got a lot of compliments. You'll be able to see the chat. A lot of compliments. Everybody's very happy with your talk. You really brought somebody said you really brought the project alive for us. And
thank you.
they're asking where you live.
Where
I'm not, she
How-
says, how far away do they live?
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, I think they're right now in the foothills of the Sierras. This is their native ancestral land, but if I remember correctly, it is quite a long drive for them. Like if I remember, it's 3 hours to 4 hours each way. So it needs to be a multiple day. It needs to have, you know, resources for camping and such. It's not a simple day trip. And a lot of that is because they didn't have any land for the longest time. So, you know, it's going to be a slow process, and making sure they're not, you know, there's a lot of excitement about this and other things, and making sure that they're ready. That's what I kept on hearing from Val, is that you don't want to take on too much. We want to take on the right amount and do it really well. So I think that's a little bit of what's happening. And, you know, I think initially some of us really wished, oh, we're so excited to be planting next to the Amamuts, and it never quite happened. But, you know, there's a lot of years left where this can still happen. So
It's interesting. I wasn't aware there was an Amamutsan community per se. I mean, actual physical community.
yeah, so and you really sense it when they have these tremendous ceremonies, and you'll see 80 people out there and a lot of elders. And like I said, not so many people speak the language anymore, and there's only a few people actively learning it. So they're really, you know, in a unique place right now where they're trying to figure out where to put their resources and their capabilities. The tribe doesn't own this land now, but they do have an easement, a cultural easement to, you know, interact and hold ceremonies on the land. And I think they are working right now with Midpen and a couple other areas to actually have land of their own. So I wish I was a little bit more up to date on that. I apologize, and I don't want to mislead you, but their website is really nice and talks about their creation story. And the film is a great start, and then recommend, you know, reading more about them. Val Lopez, their chairman, has always been a wonderful individual, and you know, he'll happily sit and talk to you for hours about their culture, their history. He is an incredible individual. So very spiritual and a remarkable person to spend time with.
It looks like Marie put up the link to their website. So that's great. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you.
And the land right now is owned by the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District, correct?
Yep. So this is Midpen, or MROSD. So if you go onto their site, this is, I think, officially called the Sierra Azul Preserve, because it includes the lower lands also. It may be called out as Mount Umunhum, but they now do own it. So when it was transferred from the Army, they were given the decontamination portion of it. You know, there was a kind of a land swap. You trade land for responsibility a lot of times with the federal government when bases are decommissioned. And sometimes that can be really scary. But this site luckily didn't have a remarkable issues with contamination that I'm aware of. So yeah, Midpen is Mid-Penn and Steve Abers. I can't say enough about Steve and his leadership there. I knew him from East Bay Mud. He was the general manager there, and really phenomenal spiritual person who really helped put this together and have a whole lot of guidance in that vision for creating this space and really creating the cultural mandate around it.
That's great. And I think the contamination right now is in the building, which is still fenced off, right?
Correct.
That's
so-
the major contamination problem they're trying to figure out how to deal with, I think.
Correct. And Patty, I'm sorry, it is an Air Force base, yes. I shouldn't be using those terms interchangeably. I apologize, didn't mean to offend. But in terms of the federal lands, I've worked on a number of federal lands, and there's a history of sometimes a fair amount of contamination that has to be dealt with, so.
Well, I don't see any more questions. I want to thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us on this.
Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about this site. And for more information, actually, there are volunteer days at some point, going to be volunteer days. If you go on to Mid-Peninsula Open Space, a lot of these are hush-hush, so you actually have to sign up for their emails. They don't put this one just on their general calendar because it fills up so quickly. But you can find volunteer opportunities, and hopefully we'll have some seed collection and other stewardship activities up there in the future as things become safer for group activities.
That sounds great. And just for everybody's information, we are recording this, and we will have the recording available